Hello and welcome back to our journey through Revelation. We are turning once again to this book at the very end of the Bible, and I'm so excited because we get to dive into chapter 14 this week. And there's so many different things to talk about. Last week we watched with John as he saw the vision of the woman and the dragon and the vision of the two different beasts, the one from the sea and the one from the land. Satan has been cast down out of heaven and he is rampaging on the earth. And that is what we talked about last week, how Satan is tormenting the people of God and has been tormenting the people of God and the offspring of the woman, aka the church. And Revelation 12 and 13 is really focused on this persecution of God's people by all of those who are following the dragon or worshiping the beast, as we learned last week. But we're moving on from that this week as we dive into Revelation 14. In chapter 14, we get a picture of the final judgment, as well as a picture of the reward for those who persevere to the end. So let's go ahead and dive in and look at this chapter. Revelation 14 begins another vision. John starts off by saying, "Then I looked," and we've moved through this section with John saying something similar several different times as the vision changes. So he sees this, then he sees this, and so this is a new vision. And in this vision, he sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And so he sees this picture or this vision of the Lamb, and we're told the Lamb isn't alone, but the 144,000. So that's hearkening back to earlier in Revelation when we first met the 144,000. Back in Revelation 7, and we learned that they had the seal of God on their foreheads. And here we're told that that seal is the name of the Lamb and of his father's name. So the Lamb is standing there on Mount Zion. And this is really in contrast to the images and the visions of the beasts that we've seen in the previous chapter. So it's an interesting contrast. If you want to go back and look over those, the vision of the two beasts, the Lamb and the 144,000 are standing in stark contrast to that chapter immediately before. And we have the term Mount Zion. Now Zion appears 155 times in the Old Testament, and it can refer to God's dwelling in the temple. So the place where the temple was, and God tabernacled with his people, dwelled with his people in the temple. But it also can refer to God's people. Often when we hear the term Zion, also it means the true city of God, the eternal city that God will rule over at the end of history. And it is that image that is captured here with this phrase Mount Zion, the end time city where God is going to dwell with his people. He is going to protect them and keep them safe and secure. His people being the remnant of the faithful, those from all eras of history who have been faithful to him. They will find refuge here in this city. Now we come to this number 144,000. When we talked about the 144,000 back in Revelation 7, we discussed how this number is most likely symbolic of all the people of God from every era of history. So if you take the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, that's where we get and then you multiply that by 1,000, which would be like this completeness, like super completeness. It's this indicator of the full number of God's people in every era of history. So the true Israel. And we're told that this 144,000 are those who have the seal of the divine name. So they have God's name on their foreheads and indicating their genuine membership in the community of God's people. And this is definitely standing in contrast to those followers of the beast that we learned about last week who bear the mark of the beast. And then we're told in verse 2 that John hears a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and a loud peal of thunder. And the sound he heard was like that of harpists playing their harps, and they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. And so they are praising God, this new song, a new song of praise for God's victory over sin, over death, over all evil. There's images here that harken that are echoes really of Psalm 2. I encourage you to go back and read that psalm. It's very interesting if you read that and then kind of come back and read this section here in Revelation 14. So many echoes of the Old Testament in Revelation. But he hears this voice of a multitude. So if the 144,000 is just an indicator of the completeness of all of God's people rather than just a specific number, then really what John is hearing is the multitude of the people of God praising God for what he is doing, what he has done. And then what comes next is a description of these redeemed people. And he points out three different things about these people. The first one is that they are chaste. So that we're told that they are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. And many scholars have thought that this is probably based on the background of how Israelite soldiers were required to maintain ceremonial purity before battle, so abstain from sexual relations before battle. And that's where this imagery is coming from. And really, though, this imagery of being chaste, so number one is this group of redeemed people are chaste, is that they are uncompromising with the world. They did not defile themselves. So if you think about the idolatry that is rampant, that was rampant during John's time, that's rampant in all pages of history, these are those people who did not defile themselves by participating in it, who have been called out of it. They have not been defiled by those things. We could say that they're uncompromising, they're loyal to Christ, and they are pure as a bride is. And I think this really does tie in well with John's message to the churches. I mean, think about what he was telling the churches we studied way back at the beginning of this series. He was calling them to remain faithful and to remain uncompromising and unwavering in their faith. He was also calling them to return to their first love, to make sure that they were following Christ and Christ alone. And that leads us to the second the second description of this group of people, this redeemed group, and it's that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They identify with Christ and not the world. We're told that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind, and they are offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. And this image of first fruits is kind of interesting because that also goes all the way back to the Old Testament. And we think about how the people were required to bring their first fruits of their harvest, of their firstborn, of their livestock, of their firstborn sons. And they were required to bring them to God as an offering, as a way of saying they are set apart as a people of God. They are God's people. And so this first fruits could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. It could be interpreted as a small group of martyrs throughout the pages of church history, or a small group at the very end who are a foreshadowing of the larger group to be saved later. But also this image of first fruits could stand for this totality of all believers who offer themselves as living sacrifices to God, as a people who are set apart, who follow God wholeheartedly. They offer themselves completely. And really, we hear both here. So we have this group is described as chaste. They're also described as identifying with Christ, following him wherever he goes. And the third thing we find out about them is in verse 5. No lie was found in their mouths, and they are blameless. So as they follow Christ wherever he goes, as they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, they begin to take on the Lamb's characteristics. They have his attributes. Their lives start to look more like his. So this vision that John has in Revelation 14 begins with this vision of the redeemed, of those who are persevering, who are faithful to the end. And then things turn, and we have a vision of 3 different angels. So at this point, the vision shifts from a focus on the redeemed to the unredeemed, those in the world who have chosen to follow the beast. We find out in verse 6 that John sees another angel flying in mid-air, or some interpretations say mid-heaven, and that he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." So this first angel has a message of coming judgment. It's a declaration that judgment is imminent. And this message is really a warning to the unbelieving world. A warning that judgment is coming and that there will be consequences for worshiping that which is created instead of the creator of all. This angel calls the people to fear God and give him glory because the hour of judgment has come. The wait is over. Final judgment is upon you. And often when we hear the word gospel in scripture, we associate it with the grace side of things. Gospel means good news, and we often talk about God's grace and how he extends grace to us. But here we hear a more emphasis on the judgment aspect, the justice aspect of this. That they following God, if you don't follow God, there's going to be consequences. But this message, even though it is a little bit more focused on the judgment and justice aspect, is good news to the saints, to those who have been faithful, to the faithful martyrs, to those who've been persecuted, because it represents the end of the rule of sin and death and evil, when it will be vanquished forever. Then in verse 8, we see the second angel immediately follows, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." So we see Babylon mentioned here. And Babylon has not been an empire for centuries at this point when John is writing. It was in the 580s BC that the people of Judah were carted off into exile, the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. But this phrase, "fallen is Babylon the Great," reminds us of Daniel 4 and Nebuchadnezzar's prideful statement right before he has his incident where he thinks he is a donkey and lives in the fields for several years. He proclaims that Babylon the Great, and he goes off and says all of these prideful statements. You can read that in Daniel 4:30. So this does connect us all the way back to that. But really, Babylon is just standing for all of the idolatrous regimes we've seen throughout the pages of world history. Rome and all the other evil empires and world systems, political systems, economic systems, social systems that have come into power on the pages of world history, that are in power currently. I think if we were to sit here and think about it, we could name so many different ones from all corners of the world. And what I notice here is this corrupting influence of these evil empires of Babylon, making all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. It's a corrupting influence. Then a third angel in verse 9 comes and says in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name." So we had the first angel that gave warning that judgment was coming. The second angel that is declaring the judgment is happening. Babylon is fallen. And the third angel that is proclaiming this eternal judgment. Those who have worshiped the beast, who received the mark of the beast, they have to endure eternal judgment. And it's an interesting juxtaposition here of those who drink Babylon's wine will then have to drink the wine of God's judgment. It's a very interesting juxtaposition here in these images and these visions. And they'll experience the full measure of God's judgment, the fire and brimstone, all of that. Fire in Revelation, where we've talked about this before, is a symbol of judgment. And we get very much a sense of the eternal nature, the unending smoke, the ongoing suffering of those unbelievers in these verses. I think it's really interesting because as we look here at these next verses, there's an interesting contrast. So look with me starting in verse 12. It says, "This calls for patient endurance on his part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus." So the focus shifts a little bit back to those who follow Jesus, to the redeemed. "Then I heard a voice from heaven say, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on.' Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." And so there's this interesting contrast here of those who are the people of God, the faithful, the followers of Jesus, who get a chance to, or not a chance, they get to rest from their labor. That is the reward. But those who worshiped the beast have to endure restlessness. They don't get to enter God's rest. They don't get to rest from their labor. But the faithful do. John encourages those who are the faithful, the saints, to endure to the end, to persevere. And eternal rest is the reward. And here, I really do think he's talking about all who are faithful to the end. He says that they will rest from their labor. So this image that they have been walking this path, the journey of faith, and that they've been laboring on this path. And that all the things that they have done, their deeds that have been an outflow of their faith, will follow them. And they will enter God's rest. And then we come to this final section of chapter 14, starting in verse 14. And really, this section is a vision of this final judgment at the end of history. So we're focused on the redeemed, then a little bit on the unredeemed, and now we're switching to a picture of this final judgment. And John has this vision, and he looks and he sees a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And here we should be hearing Christ Also a connection back to Daniel 7, and he has a vision of a one like the Son of Man, and definitely go and look at that. But we are meant to hear Christ. We're also, if you hear echoes of Matthew 24 and Jesus talking about how he is going to come on the clouds to judge and redeem, that is also something that we hear in this, that here is Jesus on the cloud, and he is wearing a crown of gold, and he's holding a sickle. And a sharp sickle is often a metaphor for judgment. And then we're told that there's an angel who comes out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. And so we have this angel bringing the message, saying the time is now. So coming from the place where God dwells in the temple to Christ and saying, now's the time. He's the messenger. The harvest is ready. It's time to reap the harvest. And scholars have wondered, is this a harvest of those who are redeemed, or is this a judgment on those who aren't? Well, we have the second image that is very much judgment focused, starting in verse 17. And so you get this sense that it really could be either interpretation, that Christ is harvesting kind of like a gathering of those who are faithful. Also, there is in scripture precedent that this could also be just another picture of that judgment of those who are not believing. But the second message of judgment here, we have another angel coming out of the temple, and this angel has a sharp sickle as well. And another angel then comes, and who's in charge of the fire, came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth and gathered its grapes and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which would be roughly 180 miles. So that message is definitely one that connotes more judgment imagery. We have an angel coming, once again, two angels coming out of the temple and conveying this message, and then swinging the sickle and harvesting the grapes. And they are thrown into the winepress of God's wrath, where they are trampled in that winepress. And what comes out is blood. That is a very dire image, and definitely a judgment image. But across both of these images here at the end of chapter 14, we get this impression that the time has come. It's the fullness of time, meaning like the sins of humanity have reached their full measure. And we hear, if we go back to Genesis 15, God says something similar to Abraham when he's talking about how he's telling Abraham all the things that are going to happen in the future to his people, how they're going to go to another country, and eventually they'll be enslaved. But after 400 years, they're going to be brought back. And it ends with this statement in verse, this is Genesis 15:16, that the sins of the Amorites have not yet reached their full measure. So the sense that there was a time whenever God was going to hand over the promised land to his people, and it was in this fullness of time, when the sin had reached its full measure. And that's the sense we get here, is that this harvest is now, because it is the sins of humanity have reached their full measure. And so now that is what is happening. It's time for final judgment. I thought that was an interesting point, because often when we think about, when I look around our world, there's so many things that I I just pray, like I look around, I see all the things that are happening, and I just want to pray, God, come, Lord Jesus, and say, why are we continuing? Why can't you just come now? And I think that was one of the phrases from Beale's commentary that kind of made me pause and think this week of the fullness of the sin of humanity hadn't reached its full measure. And it kind of made me stop and think and ponder. But it reminded me that my understanding is small, and my experience in this world is but a blip. But God is sovereign and he sees the whole picture. And so, and that's why that passage in Genesis kind of made me think through, because it's like he was talking to Abraham and it was stuff that was going to happen hundreds of years in the future. And Abraham's life was just this little slice, even though he lived for quite a long time. It was still such a small slice. So I think that's one of the things that helps me remember. But another thing I think as we read these passages, especially these passages about judgment, I mean, I think it's important for us to stop and ask, does this make us a little bit uncomfortable? I think there's a tendency to want to sanitize all of scripture and be like, oh, God just loves everybody, and what he does, and focus only on that and just kind of skip over the judgment aspect. And I definitely don't think we need to be going around and being like, hey, judgment is coming, everybody's terrible all the time. But I think one of the reasons why we have that tendency is that some of these passages about God's wrath and judgment make us uncomfortable. As I have gotten older and walked with Jesus longer, I actually become, I guess, more burdened for when I read these images and read these passages of God's judgment, because I look around to people I know or people I've known in the past, and I don't want them to experience that. And so sometimes I think that we kind of gloss over it, but to keep that kind of at the forefront of our mind, sometimes I think it can help us to be at the ready to share and because we want everyone to have that opportunity to enter that eternal rest. And that's one of the things that I hear when I'm reading this. I think these images should make us uncomfortable, but they should make us uncomfortable and prompt us to action, because this is what this is describing the judgment, the final judgment. And we should be bothered and prompted and kind of spurred to action to share God's love and the good news that Jesus saves us and makes a way for us to enter God's rest, that ultimate reward. That should be something that we are spurred to do when we read stuff like this in Revelation. So that is Revelation 14. Next week, we are going to be moving on ahead. We're going to finally get to our third set of 7 as we look at Revelation 15 and 16, I believe. So I hope you'll join me then. Bye.